The radio crackled at 3:47 hours with a transmission that would haunt the Pentagon for years. "Mayday, Mayday, this is Neptune 76. We are being overrun. Request immediate, immediate," then silence. Static. The kind of silence that kills careers and haunts dreams. In the operations center at Bagram Air Base, Afghanistan, Major Rebecca Phoenix Thorne stared at the tactical display showing 12 red dots, Navy SEALs from DEVGRU, surrounded by an estimated 200 Taliban fighters in the Kunar Valley. The mission had gone sideways. Intelligence was wrong. Again. The SEALs were supposed to extract a high-value target, but instead walked into a carefully orchestrated trap. Now they were pinned down in a bombed-out compound, ammunition running low, with enemy fighters closing in from 3 sides. Phoenix had seen this movie before. Different valley, different war, same ending. She'd been flying combat missions for 8 years, accumulating over 3,000 flight hours in the most dangerous airspace on Earth. Her call sign came from her uncanny ability to rise from the ashes of impossible situations, though tonight felt different. Tonight felt final. The C-130J Hercules sat on the tarmac like a sleeping giant, its 4 turboprops gleaming under harsh floodlights. Phoenix ran her pre-flight checklist with mechanical precision, but her mind was already in the valley, calculating angles, winds, and the mathematics of death. Her crew, Loadmaster Staff Sergeant Diego Vasquez, Flight Engineer Technical Sergeant Kim Wrench Park, and co-pilot Captain Marcus Tex Williams moved with quiet efficiency born from countless missions together. "Phoenix, you sure about this?" Tex asked, settling into the right seat. His drawl carried concern that military protocol couldn't quite mask. The weather briefing showed 30-knot crosswinds, clouds sealing at 800 feet, and enemy surface-to-air missiles confirmed in the area. It was a suicide run disguised as a rescue mission. Phoenix's fingers traced the worn leather of her father's dog tags, hanging beneath her flight suit. Lieutenant Colonel James Thorne had died in a helicopter crash in Somalia when she was 12. His final words to her echoed in the pre-flight silence. "Sometimes, kiddo, the only way out is through," she keyed her microphone. "Tower, this is Reaper 17 requesting immediate departure. We have souls in the dirt who need angels in the sky." The control tower's response was immediate. "Reaper 17, you are cleared for takeoff. Godspeed." As the massive aircraft rolled down the runway, Phoenix whispered the same prayer she'd said before every mission. "Lord, make me worthy of their trust." She had no idea that in the next 4 hours, she would redefine what that prayer meant. The C-130 lifted into the ink-black Afghan night, its massive frame cutting through air thick with uncertainty. Phoenix's hands moved across the controls with practiced ease, but her mind was calculating variables that could kill them all. The Kunar Valley was a geographic nightmare, narrow, steep-sided, with peaks reaching over 10,000 feet. Winds funneled through the valley like water through a garden hose, creating turbulence that had claimed aircraft far more agile than her lumbering Hercules. Intelligence reports painted a grim picture. The Taliban had been stockpiling weapons for months, turning the valley into a fortress. Surface-to-air missiles, heavy machine guns, rocket-propelled grenades, everything needed to turn the sky into a killing field. Phoenix had studied the terrain until she could fly it blind. Every ridge, every draw, every possible approach vector was burned into her memory like sacred scripture. 2 minutes out from the valley entrance, Tex announced, his voice steady despite the turbulence that was beginning to shake the aircraft. Through her night vision goggles, Phoenix could see the jagged silhouette of mountains rising like broken teeth against the star-filled sky. The radio erupted with desperate voices. The SEALs were still alive, but barely. "Neptune 76, this is Reaper 17. We're inbound with close air support and resupply. Hold tight, warriors." The response came immediately. "Reaper 17, thank God. We're down to our last magazines. Enemy is massing for final assault. Hurry." Phoenix's jaw tightened. She'd heard that same desperation in voices before, soldiers who had accepted their fate but still fought because surrender wasn't in their DNA. The irony wasn't lost on her that a woman they'd probably never take seriously was their only hope for survival. "Phoenix," Wrench called from the flight engineer station. "We've got company. Radars painting multiple surface-to-air threats lighting up all around the valley." The threat warning system began its familiar chorus of electronic chirps and alarms, the soundtrack of modern warfare. Phoenix silenced the warnings with practiced efficiency. She'd learned long ago that fear was just another instrument reading, useful for information but deadly if it controlled your decisions. "Vasquez, prep the flare dispensers. We're going to light up this valley like the 4th of July." Her loadmaster's response carried the grim humor that kept warriors sane. "Roger that, Phoenix. Fireworks show coming right up." As they approached the valley entrance, Phoenix could see muzzle flashes twinkling in the darkness below like deadly stars. The SEALs were in their final moments, and the Taliban knew it. What they didn't know was that Rebecca Thorne had never lost a warrior on her watch, and she didn't plan to start tonight. The C-130 descended into the valley like a metal angel diving into hell. At 300 feet above ground level, Phoenix leveled off and began her attack run. The darkness erupted in sheets of tracer fire as Taliban fighters opened up with everything they had. Red streaks of death lanced upward, some passing so close to the cockpit that Phoenix could see the individual bullets spinning past her windscreen. Taking fire from all sides. Techs shouted over the din of impacts against the aircraft's hull. Phoenix's response was ice-cold calm. "Copy that. Vasquez, drop flares on my mark." The C-130's defensive systems came alive, dispensing dozens of white-hot magnesium flares that turned the valley floor into a brilliant constellation of false suns. The flares served dual purposes, confusing heat-seeking missiles while providing illumination for the trapped SEALs to identify targets. Through her night vision, Phoenix could see the bombed-out compound where Neptune 76 was making their stand. The building was partially collapsed, its walls pockmarked with bullet holes and blast craters. Bodies littered the courtyard, some friendly, most enemy. The SEALs had constructed a defensive perimeter using rubble and debris, but it was clear they couldn't hold much longer. "Neptune 76, Reaper 17 has eyes on your position, marking enemy concentrations with flares. Use the light." As Phoenix banked the massive aircraft for another pass, she caught sight of something that made her blood run cold. Taliban fighters were moving up a ravine on the compound's blind side, at least 50 of them, carrying rocket-propelled grenades and assault rifles. They would be in position to overrun the SEAL position within minutes. "Techs, take the controls," Phoenix ordered, her voice carrying an authority that brooked no argument. "I'm going downstairs." She unbuckled her harness and headed aft, leaving her bewildered co-pilot to maintain their precarious flight path through the gauntlet of ground fire. Phoenix had an idea, dangerous, unprecedented, and probably suicidal. But the alternative was watching 12 American warriors die while she circled helplessly overhead. In the cargo bay, she found Vasquez preparing another load of flares. "Sergeant, I need you to open the ramp. We're going to do something that's never been done before." The loadmaster's eyes widened as Phoenix explained her plan. They were going to turn the C-130 into the world's largest, most dangerous crop duster. Instead of pesticide, they would be dispensing death from above using a technique that existed only in Phoenix's imagination and the desperate mathematics of survival. The cargo ramp slowly lowered, revealing the valley floor rushing past at 150 knots. Wind howled through the aircraft's interior, carrying the acrid smell of gunpowder and the distinctive metallic tang of tracer rounds. Phoenix clipped her safety harness to the aircraft's tie-down points and positioned herself at the edge of the ramp, staring down into what looked like a scene from Dante's Inferno. The Taliban fighters in the ravine were clearly visible now, their muzzle flashes creating a deadly light show as they advanced on the SEAL position. They had no idea that death was about to rain down from above in the form of a determined Air Force major who refused to let good men die on her watch. "Vasquez, on my mark, dump everything we've got, flares, chaff, whatever will burn. We're going to turn this valley into a furnace." The loadmaster nodded grimly. understanding immediately what Phoenix intended to do. Phoenix keyed her radio. Neptune 76, in 30 seconds you're going to see the valley light up like daylight. Use the illumination to break contact and move to the landing zone. We're coming to get you. The SEAL team leader's response was barely audible over the sound of gunfire. Roger, Reaper. We'll be ready. As the C-130 lined up for its final pass over the ravine, Phoenix felt the familiar calm that came before moments of absolute commitment. She had crossed the line from rescue mission to something far more personal. These weren't just faceless soldiers in a foreign war. They were brothers who needed her, and she would move heaven and earth to bring them home. The aircraft shuddered under renewed ground fire, but Phoenix ignored the impacts. Her world had narrowed to a single focus: the advancing enemy fighters who thought they were about to claim an easy victory. "Mark!" Phoenix shouted, and Vasquez triggered the release of every pyrotechnic device on the aircraft. The effect was instantaneous and overwhelming. Hundreds of white-hot flares cascaded from the C-130's belly, turning night into brilliant day across the entire valley floor. The sudden illumination caught the Taliban fighters completely exposed in the ravine, their advance stopped cold by the unexpected light show. But Phoenix wasn't finished. She had counted on the psychological impact of the flares, but she needed something more. As the aircraft passed over the ravine at minimum altitude, she made a decision that would have gotten her court-martialed if it hadn't saved 12 lives. Phoenix unclipped from her safety harness and stepped to the very edge of the ramp, then did something that defied every regulation in the Air Force manual. She opened fire with her sidearm, a 9 Beretta M9, into the massed enemy fighters below. It was a gesture more symbolic than tactically effective, but sometimes symbols carry more weight than bullets. The sight of an American warrior literally standing in the gates of hell, defying death while raining fire from above, shattered whatever resolve the Taliban fighters had left. They broke and ran, abandoning their assault on the compound. The SEALs seized the moment, using the illumination to break contact and begin their fighting withdrawal to the designated landing zone. Phoenix holstered her weapon and clipped back in, her hands shaking slightly from adrenaline. She had just rewritten the book on close air support, turning a cargo plane into a gunship through sheer audacity and an unbreakable commitment to never leave a warrior behind. As she headed back to the cockpit, Vasquez's voice carried a new note of respect. "Ma'am, that was the most badass thing I've ever seen." Phoenix's response was typically understated. "Just another day at the office, Sergeant." The extraction was a masterpiece of precision flying under impossible conditions. Phoenix brought the massive C-130 down onto a makeshift landing strip, really just a flat section of valley floor that looked smooth enough in the darkness. The aircraft touched down hard, bounced twice, then settled onto what passed for a runway in the Afghan wilderness. Before the aircraft had even stopped rolling, the ramp was lowering and the SEALs were sprinting toward safety. Phoenix watched through her side window as 12 shadows emerged from the darkness, carrying their wounded and dragging their gear. They moved with the practiced efficiency of elite warriors, but she could see the exhaustion in their movements, the weight of a battle that had pushed them to their absolute limits. "Ramp up, let's get out of here," Tex called as the last SEAL stumbled aboard. Phoenix didn't need encouragement. She pushed the throttles forward, and the 4 turboprops responded with a roar that echoed off the valley walls. The takeoff was even more harrowing than the landing. Overloaded with passengers and low on fuel, the aircraft clawed for altitude while Taliban fighters resumed their ineffective ground fire. But Phoenix had performed this dance before. She knew exactly how much abuse the Hercules could take, exactly how much lift those massive wings could generate, exactly how to coax maximum performance from an aircraft that had seen too many missions and carried too many secrets. As they climbed out of the valley, Phoenix finally allowed herself to breathe. In the cargo bay behind her, Navy SEALs were receiving medical treatment and counting their blessings. They had walked into hell and walked back out, carried by an Air Force crew that had redefined the meaning of close air support. The mission that was supposed to end in disaster had instead become a legend that would be whispered about in special operations circles for years to come. Phoenix keyed her radio. Bagram Tower, this is Reaper 17 with 12 precious packages inbound. Request priority handling and medical team standing by. The tower's response carried genuine emotion. Reaper 17, you are cleared for immediate approach. Outstanding work out there. As the lights of Bagram Air Base appeared on the horizon, Phoenix realized that something fundamental had changed in that valley. She had stopped being just another pilot and become something else entirely. The debriefing lasted until dawn, with intelligence officers and mission commanders trying to understand how a routine extraction had turned into what they were already calling the most audacious close air support mission in Air Force history. Phoenix sat through the questions with characteristic calm, downplaying her role and emphasizing her crew's performance. But the SEALs weren't buying her modesty. Team leader Lieutenant Commander Jake "Razor" Morrison had been running special operations for 15 years, and he knew heroism when he saw it. "Ma'am," he said during a break in the briefing, "what you did up there, that wasn't in any manual I've ever read. You saved our asses through pure balls and brilliant flying." Phoenix accepted the compliment with a slight nod, but her mind was already moving to the next mission, the next group of warriors who might need angels in the sky. The official reports would sanitize the events, reducing Phoenix's actions to dry military prose about innovative tactical employment of assets and outstanding airmanship under extreme conditions. But the SEALs who lived through that night knew better. They had witnessed something that couldn't be captured in after-action reports or commendation write-ups. They had seen a warrior's warrior, someone who understood that sometimes the only way to honor the trust placed in you is to risk everything. Word spread through the special operations community with the speed of a prairie fire. The female Air Force major who had stood in the door of a C-130 and personally engaged enemy fighters with her sidearm. The pilot who had turned a cargo plane into a precision weapons system through sheer audacity and skill. Phoenix's phone started ringing within hours of the mission's completion. Requests for interviews, speaking engagements, book deals, the full circus that accompanied modern military heroism. She declined them all. Her war wasn't about publicity or personal recognition. It was about the sacred trust between warriors, the unbreakable bond that said no one gets left behind, no matter what. As she walked across the flight line toward her quarters, Phoenix felt the weight of expectation settling on her shoulders. She had crossed a line that night, moving from competent pilot to something approaching legend. The pressure would only intensify from here. But Phoenix had learned something important in that Afghan valley. She had discovered that the line between possible and impossible existed mainly in the minds of people who had never been tested by fire. When warriors were dying and conventional solutions had failed, the impossible became just another option to explore. Her father's dog tags felt warm against her chest as she finally allowed herself to smile. Lieutenant Colonel James Thorne would have been proud of his daughter, the little girl who had grown up to become the angel that other angels called when they needed saving. The medal ceremony 3 months later was held at the Pentagon, attended by senior Air Force leadership and representatives from every major command. Phoenix stood at attention as the Secretary of the Air Force read the citation for her Distinguished Flying Cross with Valor, for extraordinary heroism while participating in aerial combat operations against an armed enemy of the United States. The formal language couldn't capture the reality of that night in the Kunar Valley, the split-second decisions that meant the difference between life and death for 12 American warriors. But Phoenix understood that some things couldn't be reduced to words on paper or ribbons on a uniform. The real recognition came from different sources: the quiet nods from fellow aircrew members, the respectful silence when she entered the officers' club, the way conversation stopped when someone mentioned her call sign. After the ceremony, she found herself surrounded by young Air Force officers eager to hear war stories and gain wisdom from someone who had become a living legend. Phoenix discouraged such hero worship, but she understood its source. In an age of precision-guided munitions and sterile technological warfare, her actions represented something more primal and personal. She had looked death in the eye and refused to blink, standing literally in harm's way to ensure that good men made it home to their families. The story had grown in the telling, as military stories always do, but the core truth remained unchanged. Sometimes ordinary people are called to do extraordinary things, and their response defines not just their own character, but the character of the institution they represent. The requests for transfer came from every major command in the Air Force. Special Operations Command wanted her expertise in developing new close air support tactics. Air Combat Command offered positions that would fast-track her to senior leadership. Even the Pentagon requested her services for strategic planning roles that would guarantee promotion and prestige. Phoenix turned them all down. Her war was in places like Afghanistan, flying missions that pushed the boundaries of the possible while supporting warriors who asked for nothing more than someone to watch their backs. She had found her calling in the fire and chaos of combat operations, and she wasn't ready to trade that purpose for the comfortable mediocrity of a staff assignment. The recognition that mattered most came from an unexpected source. Lieutenant Commander Morrison appeared at her squadron one morning, carrying a package wrapped in brown paper. Inside was a framed photograph of the 12 SEALs from Neptune 76, all of them alive and smiling at some reunion gathering. At the bottom, in precise military lettering, was a simple inscription: "To Phoenix, who gave us our tomorrows. Semper Fi, Neptune 76." Morrison's message was equally direct. "Ma'am, we wanted you to see the faces of the men who are alive because you were willing to risk everything for people you'd never met. That's the definition of honor in our book." Phoenix accepted the gift with characteristic grace, but privately she was deeply moved. This was why she flew combat missions, why she pushed herself and her aircraft to the absolute limits of performance and endurance. Not for medals or recognition, but for the simple knowledge that good men would go home to their families, because she had been willing to do her job when it mattered most. The war in Afghanistan would continue for several more years, and Phoenix would fly dozens of additional combat missions. But the legend of the Kunar Valley would follow her like a shadow, defining her reputation and setting an impossible standard for future operations. Young pilots would study her tactics, trying to understand how she had transformed a cargo aircraft into a precision weapons system through pure audacity and skill. The official Air Force histories would record her innovations in close air support, the way she had redefined what was possible when conventional solutions failed. But the real legacy of that night wasn't captured in tactical manuals or historical analyses. It lived in the unbreakable bond between warriors, the understanding that some people can be counted on to do whatever it takes when lives hang in the balance. Phoenix never spoke publicly about the emotions she felt during those 4 hours over the Kunar Valley. The fear, the determination, the moment of absolute clarity when she knew that failure wasn't an option because 12 good men were counting on her. Military culture discouraged such introspection, preferring the clean narrative of heroic action uncomplicated by doubt or human frailty. But those who knew her best, her crew, her fellow pilots, the maintainers who kept her aircraft flying, understood that her strength came not from an absence of fear, but from her willingness to act decisively despite it. She had learned that courage wasn't the lack of fear, but the judgment that something else was more important than fear. On that night in Afghanistan, the lives of 12 American warriors had been more important than her own safety, and she had acted accordingly. The final chapter of the Kunar Valley story wasn't written until nearly a decade later, when Phoenix was serving as a squadron commander at Dover Air Force Base. A young second lieutenant, fresh from pilot training and eager to make his mark, approached her after a safety briefing with the kind of question that only comes from someone who has never seen combat. "Ma'am," he asked, "how did you know that crazy plan would work? What if you'd been wrong?" Phoenix studied the young officer's face, seeing something of her own younger self in his earnest expression and untested confidence. Her answer carried the weight of years and the wisdom that only comes from surviving situations where being wrong meant people died. Lieutenant, I didn't know it would work, but I knew that doing nothing would definitely fail, and 12 good men would die because I was too afraid to try something new. Sometimes in this business, you have to choose between a small chance of success and the certainty of failure. The choice isn't really a choice at all. The young pilot nodded solemnly, filing away this lesson for some future moment when his own courage would be tested, and his own judgment would mean the difference between life and death. Phoenix watched him walk away, remembering her own early days when the difference between courage and stupidity seemed impossibly thin, and the weight of responsibility for other people's lives felt overwhelming. The cycle would continue, young warriors learning from older ones, taking their own risks, and making their own choices when the moment demanded everything they had to give. Years later, when Phoenix had retired from active duty and was working as a civilian contractor training the next generation of military pilots, she would sometimes catch herself staring out at the flight line, where young aircrew members prepared for missions that might define their own legacies. The C-130s looked the same, their massive frames unchanged by advances in technology or the passage of time. But the people who flew them were different, shaped by different conflicts and facing different challenges. What remained constant was the fundamental truth she had learned over the Kunar Valley, that ordinary people are capable of extraordinary things when they refuse to accept that someone else's life is less important than their own comfort or safety. The legend of Phoenix would eventually fade, replaced by new stories of heroism and sacrifice. But the lesson would endure, passed from one generation of warriors to the next like a sacred trust that bound them together across time and conflict. In her final years, when arthritis made it painful to climb into an aircraft cockpit, and her hair had turned silver from decades of stress and responsibility, Phoenix would still wake up sometimes in the middle of the night, hearing the phantom sound of radio calls from warriors in trouble. She would lie in bed listening to the silence, remembering the weight of trust that had been placed in her hands, and the knowledge that 12 families had stayed intact, because she had been willing to risk everything when it mattered most. The nightmares came less frequently now, replaced by a quiet satisfaction that she had honored the trust placed in her by a country that asked its young people to go in harm's way for causes larger than themselves. The sky had been her cathedral, the cockpit her confessional, and the lives she had saved her absolution for the sins of surviving when others had not. As she closed her eyes and drifted back to sleep, Phoenix whispered the same prayer that had sustained her through decades of combat. Lord, make me worthy of their trust. In the silence that followed, she could almost hear her father's voice answering. You already have, kiddo. You already have.